I will be discussing controllerism, which is a music performance practice that, although shares common histories and intersects development trajectories with practices that are at the forefront of academic research, it remains largely absent from academic publications. So I will start by presenting a literature review that will contextualize a practice. I will present some common definition of the practice, describe some of the performance instruments, and then I will explore its precursors, historical developments, and discuss the autodidactic nature that characterizes the practice. I will then discuss some of the cultural consideration of using particular types of interfaces in music performance. And that will be followed by comparison of performance norms and techniques between controllerism and two established electroacoustic performance practices, acousmatic diffusion and live coding. And then I will conclude by mentioning some of my outputs that emerged from this research, both existing and upcoming ones, and conclude by posing some questions on the possible reasons behind the lack of literature on controllerism. So we can start by just discussing what is controllerism, because I'm sure a lot of people here might be familiar with the topic, or some might be completely not. So in very simple words, controllerism, as defined by the person that coined the term controllerism, is the art of manipulating sound and creating music live using computer controllers and software. So in other words, controllerism entails digitally generated sound from software, while the human performer interacts with the software by physical interfaces that often mimic the controls found on mixing consoles, such as faders, potentiometers, diodes, buttons, touch strips, and more recently, even systems that allows performers the control of digital files through full-size digital turntables. Now, this is a very growing area that is commercially lucrative for many music technology companies, of course. Moreover, but this is a fairly recent development. Enrique Thomas actually locates the origin of the practice in the mid-2000s, which is in tandem with the emergence of digital DJs, meaning those that play music from digital files as opposed to those using vinyl records or CDs, which is a more traditional approach in DJ practice. However, the two practices, controllerism and digital DJ practice, are in fact as distinct as their analog counterparts. So again, Moldover, who coined the term, suggests that controllerist borrows its name from turntablism. So here, Moldover adds to this connect by connecting the term controllerism and turntablism, and quite like the latter, aims to distinguish themselves from DJ practice. So what's the difference between the two practices? Traditionally, DJ practice refers to the playback and blending of fixed compositions in a coherent mix, with a performer aiming to match the pre-recorded material's tempo by manipulating each track's playback speed by adjusting the turntable pitch control, and to morph between the spectral content by adjusting each track's equalizer controls found on their analog mixers. In contrast, turntablism extends these techniques with the aim of creating original compositions. As well as the aforementioned adjustments in playback speed and equalization, turntablists further utilize altering of pitch and direction of speed and playback by directly interfacing with the record. Moreover, they can alter the tracks and onset articulation through interfacing with the mixer's faders. And more techniques have been added to the turntablist lexicon over the years, such as phrase rearrangement and expansion, performing melodic phrases through adjusting playback speed of fixed tones, and so on and so on. So, musicologist and hip-hop ethnographer Mark Katz emphasized the seriousness of turntablist practice, suggesting that the suffix ism is placing its performers on par with the virtuosity evident in performance of traditional acoustic instruments. Now, going back to controllerism, this aims to push turntablist practice further by affording performers new ways of manipulating sounds. Now, some of the criticism aimed at early digital DJs were that the equipment able to automatically synchronize digital files on a sample level makes the practice easier and removes the challenge or virtuosity of manually synchronizing two records while they're playing, therefore bringing the notion of authenticity in DJ practice in a question, in DJ practice in the digital domain. So the earlier session of controllerism affording new ways for performers to manipulate existing recordings and approaching the role of live composer appears in the discussion between Tobias van Veen and Bernardo Atias. So here the two scholars, while reserving some skepticism for digital DJs, they recognize that those who harness the affordances of digital format hold the potential to move the practice forwards and indeed reach the level of creating compositions on stage. So a further characteristic of controllerism that is often mentioned as a benefit is its ability to obscure the use of computers in performance by solely relying on the controller interface. In this camp of thought, the computer poses as a device which critics suggest alienates audiences, certainly during its introduction in the club performance environment. Although it should be said that nowadays, laptops in DJ booth are as ubiquitous as digital media player turntables, such as the Pioneer CDJ, which replaced the de facto standard in nightclubs, the Technics 1200, after Panasonic stopped producing it, before they brought it back because they saw they can sell loads of it, of course. These are some similar aims for controllerism. The tangible interface aims to move the performer away from the computer, hence allow the audience to witness the manipulation of an instrument as the means by which sound is commanded, regardless of the fact that the computer remains the sole sound generating device during the performance, and indeed is often the tool that creates the original composition manipulated by the performers. And hence emerges the first clash of interface identities. Whereas in electroacoustic music performances and generally computer music performances, the computer is almost always visible, whether it's used as a playback system for acousmatic diffusion or as the actual performance interface in live coding. In contrast, controllerism, particularly in these earliest renditions, which was quite militant, aimed to unrestrict the performer from having to stand behind the computer screen and, if possible, eliminate all interaction with the computer altogether during the performance. So this topic of interface identities, I will be discussing it later in more depth. As a first, I really need to present some examples of controllerist practice so people can start understanding what I'm talking about. But before I do that, it is important that I mention the origins of this practice, which of course are common origins with DJ culture and turntablism, which of course the techniques that gave birth to dub music. So as it was common in the Jamaican music industry in the 60s, bands will record a song and then the mixing engineer will create an altered copy to be printed on the single record's B-side. These altered copies, or versions as they were known at the time, exploded the recent advent of multi-track technologies for the time. So with the compositions re-recorded usually by omitting the vocals or applying some static spatial effects to certain tracks, such as reverb and delay, as to distinguish these from the original track on the A-side. So in the case of the omitted vocals, this was done as to provide a rhythm track for the vocalists who performed alongside the music selectors. So this music industry necessity for versions was later developed in a distinct art form, primarily by Osmond Ruddock, better known as King Tubby. So Ruddock went further than simply creating a different static mix for the versions he was commissioned to do, and instead used the available mixing equipment as performance instruments. The studio performance approach resulted in a radically different composition to the original counterparts and demonstrates the first instance of manipulating fixed recordings in popular music practice. Of course, this is something that the electroacoustic and avant-garde communities have been doing for much, much earlier than that. But of course, we're discussing popular practices here. So as an example, here's a very simple analysis I threw together some time ago, where it compares the original piece sung by Jacob Miller, Baby I Love You So, and the dub version created by a collaboration between King Tubby and Augustus Pablo, known for his melodica playing. And we can see just the significant differences in terms of the onset of each element and the type of effects that put on. And like I said, it's a very simplistic analysis, and I do invite people to read Delera Blanes' analysis of the same piece, which goes in a lot more depth, but obviously I only have another 11 minutes, so I will try to move forward. So, as I said, this studio performance, so there's 2 points of interest here regarding discussing King Tubby and the advent of dub music. First of all, through his practice, Tubby was able to elevate the status of the engineer on par with that of the performing musicians, and indeed, at his untimely death in '89, Tubby was one of the most well-known personalities in Jamaica's arts industry. But the other point, and perhaps more pertinent to this discussion, is that this new music genre was invented by someone who had no formal musical training, but rather relied on his knowledge of engineering. So this autodidactic musicianship was further parallel with the invention of hip-hop music by a compatriot of Tubby, Clive Campbell, better known as DJ Kool Herc. Again, this is someone without any training in music theory or instrument playing, and Campbell was able to utilize his experience in Jamaica sound system culture after moving to the Bronx of New York in the early 70s. And he went to establish the first turntablist techniques by inventing the looping technique merry-go-round, where he would layer 2 copies of the same record as to repeat specific segments that best resonate with his audiences. In contrast to King Tubby, who was highly experienced in engineering and designing bespoke mixing equipment and effect processors, in Campbell's case, his knowledge was restricted to operating commercially available DJ instruments, meaning turntables and analog mixer, therefore being even further restricted in the options for manipulating the fixed recordings, who were further restricted themselves to a stereo channel rather than multi-tracks available to dub performers. So it is perhaps exactly this restriction that pushed Campbell and his contemporaries to further develop turntable manipulation techniques and pave the way for an entirely new mode of live music performance. So this is just a little bit of the background and origins of such practice that eventually gave birth to controllerism. So I want to just throw some examples. We have another 10 minutes, so hopefully we will have time for them. So first of all, I will play a performance by Paolo Baldini. And again, I know it's, I'm showing an Italian white person performing what is very much a black style of music, but I'm only doing it because of the quality of the performance and the capture of the performance, rather than some vintage Jamaican videos from the late 70s. So here we see a quite apt example of how multi-tracks can be arranged over a mixer, and then with the use of effects, and of course the routing that this mixing console allows, effects can be applied, and how these effects can be manipulated in a performative manner. So the next piece I want to show is moving away from this tradition, and we're coming to a quite early example of controllerist practice, even before the term was coined. This is by performer Tim Exile. On a very early demonstration for Native Instruments, a company that he's still associated with. I'll just let the video speak for itself for a minute. So again, I should also point out that this video is way before controllers became a thing, so therefore the computer is still visible, as we know as much concerned with this issue. But what is of interest is the commonality between the controllers from the traditional dub performance and this digital counterpart, with faders, potentiometers, buttons, of course this time communicating just digital information to the computer that generates the sound and sonic manipulations. A more recent performance from Tim Exile shows how this practice has developed over the years with the advent of newer controllers and softwares, of course. I'm just going to move quickly because I'm just conscious of time. So again, we can see here now the computer in this time is outside the performance field of view, assuming you do the affordances of the newly acquired instruments which offer more control options with a more limited scope of the previous ones. Now, so this performance being from about 2009. I have another one from about the same time, and this is by the person that coined the term controller, which is Moldova. And what is particularly interesting about that is not only the arrangement of the instrument is similar to that of almost a rock concert, but also the mannerisms of the performer is very similar to hip hop culture and in fact, turntablist battles. So of course, these are all processes that perhaps are not particularly impressive, especially within the field, as simple spatial effects and manipulations of volume. But in my opinion, it is the actual interface that is something that can connect with audiences, as I will discuss more later on. And an even more recent performance is by Laura Scudder, who has gone to over the years to create performances for quite well-known and mainstream acts like The Weeknd, Kanye West, and so on. And here's performing, but in this time, she's performing with controllers that have gone to become the standards in the field of controllering, such as the Ableton Push and Livid's Ohm, although the company is now defunct, unfortunately. Okay, so the first thing to know from these examples that are presented is of course, they're joined by the theme of electronic music that is closer to popular styles. Now, the other thing that's common is the connection between the performance inputs and the musical consequences that emanate from the inputs. So in the field of new instruments for musical expression, this connection refers to transparency, which becomes one of the main features of controllerism. What I want to place as examples, I guess, is a performance practice that has enjoyed stratospheric popularity amongst the seekers of academic research, which of course is live coding. To benefit this comparison, I selected an example that approaches the aesthetics of those previous controllerist examples, which is a performance of live coded techno by Graham Dunning. Now, it could be argued that this performance of live coding, in fact, offers more visibility for the musical inputs and the musical consequences. In fact, the projected codes allowed us to witness exactly which processes are initiated at which moment. However, it's not the performer that we place our attention to, but rather the computer screen. Indeed, the very same instrument controller strives to eliminate from the audience viewpoint. Now, this is of course not to say that either practice is somehow superior to another. That's not the point. It's not comparative. I'm not trying to put anyone down, one practice or another. This observation concerns our engagement with the human performer, akin to that of observing a musician performing with traditional acoustic instruments. So as such, this comparison concludes that controllerism as a computer music performance practice is why is the obsession of controllers with obscuring the digital sound source so different to rock guitarists moving away from the cabinets that shape and project the instrument tones? Or even perhaps Wagner's insistence that the orchestra performing his compositions resides in a pit away from the audience viewpoint, as to allow them to concentrate on the actors. And I know perhaps this is a bit of a stretch of an example, but the point is, I wish to put forward, is that as far as computer music performance practices go, controllerism appears as the closest specimen to that of a traditional music performance. And of course, controllerism is not without its critics. And that was a quote regarding the transparency of interaction, which is very common amongst the nine field. So Holly Herndon, a quite well-known composer, performer, and technologist more recently, suggests that the main issue with controllerist label is that, quite like the DJ and turntablist lineage from which they emerge, is firstly defined by the tools before any sound is even produced. And it is this which creates an often impassable gate for audiences to accept it as a spectacle akin to a performance with an acoustic instrument. And unlike its predecessors, who were limited to tools most of the audiences already had in their homes, which is records and turntables, the wonderful technology that allows controllers to do so much more has also brought with it an opaque barrier for the audience. However, I would argue that these barriers are broken down and faster and faster as time progresses, largely due to the ubiquitous digital technology that now surrounds the public. So Michael Derrico, in his doctoral thesis, he suggests that the instruments used in controllerist practice actually are not that dissimilar to those we use to watch television programs, listen to music at home, navigate our route around a car trip, and notify our followers of our grand achievements or mundane daily grievances. So I cannot but agree with this sentiment. Surely the turntable was one as alien as today's MIDI controller, yet the former became household items. And the latter, the MIDI controller, is about as complicated the physical operation as using a modern kitchen appliance, with a digital principle carefully illustrated over manuals and demonstration videos for companies competing to earn your trust and dedication. So, in my opinion, is this immediate connection between seeing a string being plucked, followed immediately by the emanating note that dissolves all barriers between artist and audience, allowing the audience to appreciate and identify with the artist, notwithstanding the level of skill and dedication that goes into mastering the instrument. So, of course, I want to present a balanced viewpoint in defense of live coding. Live coding is undoubtedly the most inclusive and accessible computer music practice. It requires very little investment other than a moderately priced computer, with all the software being freely available. And this is combined with a community that champions sharing of knowledge and vehemently safeguards inclusion of underrepresented performers. Of course, there's no wonder that it has reached so far into practitioners' minds. The only drawback in relation to my central point is that perhaps live coding dehumanizes the performer during the performance, where the performer is painted as a typist, and as well as the learning curve required towards understanding a harness in coding. So in contrast, everyone can press a button, flick a switch, twist a dial, move a fader along these rails. So therefore understand the corresponding motion. And if the consequence of that motion is the creation of sound in real time, we have reached a formation example of the guitarist plucking a string. And if we combine this with rhythmical awareness, dedication to develop the muscle memory traverse swiftly across the tactile controls of the controller, ability to understand instructions from the manufacturers and the software and hardware products, and of course, unknown a significant amount of distinguishing interesting sounds and blending them, then anyone can be a controllerist. Another characteristic that I believe it brings it closer to traditional music performance is a level of risk involved within the performance. No unlike using turntables unorthodoxly as gestural instruments, the level of complexity that controllerist systems can reach is not insignificant, and even Tim Exile admits that he implements a panic button that can initialize the system he performs with. So combine this with unstable software suites as Max for Live and finite computing power and the fickle reliability of portable computers, conducting a live controllerist performance is not without a risk. And this can of course be minimized by restricting the options available to the performer for sonic manipulation, as many have done in the past, to a greater or lesser effect. So the phenomenon of the mind DJ is actually a common bête noire among circles of electronic music audience and performers alike. And many of you might not know this fella. This is Mr. Bishi, who was a drum and bass performer that was infamously caught miming a set while being paid large amounts of money for it. So, however, it is this risk and vulnerability that again brings a human element at the forefront of controllerist practice. So a relatively recent trend moves away from the trend of risk in acousmatic music, with composers opting against a diffusion performance in favor of multi-channel or ambisonic arrangements. Granted, the composition of the arrangements will be reduced in the ideal form, achieve much greater detail, accuracy, and articulation and spatialization. But again, I pose the question, isn't this dehumanizing the music even further? And as often discussed topic in electroacoustic circles is attracting audiences outside the regional practice community, listeners. I would posit that a performative element, one which demonstrates humanization with all its perils and shortcomings, holds such potential of attracting curious outsiders, even if those compositions don't get to win many awards. And of course, these are very broad stroke generalizations which I'm making to drive my earlier point of controllerist being the computer music performance practice that is closest to the traditional music performance, with all the criticism that it might attract. To return to the point of identity that I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, and the question why this obsession with computer or lack of when performing computer music. So Enrique Thomas reaches some interesting conclusions. He brings up Derrico's distinction in interface design, that is a distinction between minimalist and maximalist approaches. The latter refers to platforms such as Ableton Live, Bitwig, and other performance-oriented platforms that provide a template on which to build a performance system. On the minimalist side, we have things like Max, Pure Data, Super Collider, and so on. And he actually mentioned a comment by Miller Pouquet, who suggests that maximally software interfaces are useless for music composition because in creating software environments, you're ideally cutting out 90% of the possible algorithms that a computer is capable of. This is absolutely true. However, we're back to the previous argument that not everyone is able to harness the possibilities opened by those minimalist environments. So Thomas goes on to speak more in favor of controllerism, suggesting that musical interfaces show the ability to mediate musical expression, not only through ergonomic and functionalities, but also through certain cultural attitudes that seem to incorporate. Playing a specific type of interface can also bring the assumption of in place in politics and inherent ideologies, produced and assimilated by a particular community of users. For example, practitioners of live coding, virtuosi of retro games, music synthesis, or finger drummings, resulting in communities we usually perform with similar, if not identical, sorts of interfaces. So this interface effect comes not only as a result of a technocratic decision, but mostly as a social-political declaration of identity ingrained within the media. In other words, in the same way that music has had a legacy as a medium for communicating ideologies, the act of building, hacking, or performing with certain interfaces will mean manifesting the artistic vision and the distinct politics of its performer. So, in other words, we understand that the choice of interface is often less about being more or less malleable, performative, or affording greater possibilities for sonic manipulation, but rather as a badge of identity and belonging to a specific group of practitioners. Here we posit a controllerism with a shared heritage from non-traditional practices, close connection with subversive subcultures, is freed from the 19th century European music canons, or in the case of computer music, 20th century Western European canons, and therefore is an ideal candidate to promote a decolonialized approach in computer music performance. So at a time, there's an evident turn towards a more diverse music education, with academic institutions incorporating DJ practice with the syllabus, as well as development of graded examination systems for the practice. Perhaps this is an ideal time for controllerists to also enter the attention of computer music performance education. So I will just very quickly conclude just by saying that Controllerist has not enjoyed much publication interest, and there's many valid reasons for that. One of them is that it lacks standardization, which Turntablist has. And Turntablist actually has been the point of interest for many academics since at least as early as 2003. And this is mainly due because it has become legitimized with a transcription model and a standardization of the equipment used. This is, of course, not possible with controllerism at this stage. Of course, performers can create a notation system that can aid the performances, such as this one I made for my 2016 performance, We Knew. But of course, this is not particularly useful for someone to evaluate or even less to recreate the performance. So this is something I'm working towards now, a sort of system that can standardize controllerism and perhaps a notation, a tablature system. And recently, I had the performance that I kind of reconfigured to essentially place a non-musician dancer into the position of a controllerist through gestural controllers. And a lot of these findings have been included in a book chapter edited by Michael Filowich that it just came out last April. And just to say, for future plans, we have a project called In the Groove, where we appropriated a large vinyl collection at Hope University Liverpool. And we're aiming to create both a music library and also have some public events, public workshops for audience to come in, non-musicians, and try to create music with pre-recorded material in a controllerist manner.